and gentlemen, to this episode of the Women's Show. And today we want to begin the conversation around the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence on women and girls. And rightly so, because every year in November we set aside 16 days to, put aside critical issues that we need to interrogate. This year's theme is on Unite, and we're trying to say that we want to come together and collaborate, cooperate, and continue these efforts around, dealing with and ending gender-based violence. And in the narrative around women, we can no longer have this conversation only set for November. And so we are going to spread it across the year to make sure that collaboration is happening and cooperation is happening. To help me have this conversation are three amazing ladies who are doing work in this area. And I'll let them introduce themselves and then we set off the show. Welcome. I'll begin with you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Murungi Sanyu. I'm from Her Internet. Her Internet is a feminist organization that advocates for digital rights and digital freedoms for structurally silenced women. We also carry out research and documentation on how to use the internet and how to access it. We also look at creating a feminist and free online environment for everyone out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to the show, Sanyu.
Hello, everyone. My name is Naima Sebbi, a feminist lawyer, and I work with ActionAid International Uganda. I'm blessed to be here and happy to be back.
Welcome, Naima.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Susan Achen. I work with Uganda Women's Network. Thank you.
It's good to have you, Susan, Naima, and Sanyu. And maybe to begin the conversation, I'll begin with you, Susan. First of all, welcome back to the show. It's been a while since I last hosted you.
Yes, it has. Thank you.
When we speak violence, we've come from violence offline because there was a time the internet wasn't present. And now we've added to this conversation violence online. And so it almost feels like there's a growth that happened. That now women are no longer, violated outside the view of people, but now even online. So how do we navigate, dealing with violence on women in this new epoch? Because now we are dealing with two monsters, online and offline. Yeah.
Yes, I'm actually glad that we have Her Internet here with us today.
Yeah.
Yes, violence online is emerging. It's an emerging form of violence, which is able to, one, give, how could I put it? Violence online is actually exposing the deeper, the deeper violence that actually women go through. Violence, as you know, it is endemic in our lives. Online, the internet has just been able to expose it further. But the internet is also now a tool of perpetrating violence against women. To answer the question that you've asked, it starts with us even knowing that what we are doing is violence against women. We use these gadgets, we use the internet, we use electronic technologies, and we do not even know that the way we are using it is violating another person's rights. For us, we think it is entertainment. We think it's a source of fun. It's a reason for another laugh. I see a funny video. I make a comment. I circulate it around. But the person in the video is actually becoming, is becoming the recipient of ridicule. He or she is becoming the recipient of scorn. And it takes an emotional toll for the most part of it. I'll give you an example. Last year, one of our popular musicians, Angela Katatumba, made a statement. She said, "Nze sifumba." I do not cook. My parents taught me to go out and work. Yes. Do you remember what happened to her?
Yes.
There was this onslaught of abuse, of ridicule, of judgment that came upon her person. And that is a form of violence. But do we know it? We do not even know it. So as a country that is dealing with violence against women that seems to be, steadily increasing, how are we paying attention to online violence? There's a lot that needs to be done in raising awareness about online violence, but for duty bearers that have the task of preventing and responding to it, there's a lot that needs to be done to build their ability to recognize it, to prevent it, but also to provide safety and support services for those that are survivors of that kind of violence.
And I hear you when you say that, and maybe to bring Sanyu into this conversation on the need for digital literacy, both for the users, or actually for all the users, because apart from, a lot of people will say, oh, we need to now build resilience around, abuse online, but can we then have a push for digital literacy, and not just for a few? Because I know now we have children on the internet. We have girls on the internet who, for a better part, the pandemic pushed onto online so that school can go on. So how do we push for digital literacy in such a dispensation?
Thank you so much. Well, right now, or currently, High Internet is running a campaign on digital rights advocacy. I started early this October, and it's under the hashtags of Speak Freely, Type Freely, and then the other one is See Something, Say Something, Eugene. So under the Speak Freely, Type Freely, we look at individuals or online users gaining their power again to find a way to limit it, to have a way to prevent and have limitations over gender-based violence. And then under the See Something, Say Something, UG, here we have individuals form support groups of their own, and in case one is being violated online, they are able to reach out to someone, talk to someone, and find a way of find a way of preventing gender-based violence. So with these hashtags, we do bring out resources every day. We teach people how to use the internet. We have different tips on how to go through, on how to know your rights are being violated online, and how to support one another in case your rights are being violated. We all know a safe timeline for everybody really starts with you. So if it has to start with you, you must know how to support one another and how to protect yourself as well.
That's interesting. Me, who comes from spaces online for women, we've created a little bit of utopias where, you safeguard each other and, you call out each other if something is going astray. And I love that dynamic. And maybe to switch the conversation up, Naima, I want to bring you in on, the increased assault on women's rights as we are speaking today, because we've put, and I don't know if it's a pedestal or if it's a precedence. The Joe and Wade case opened a Pandora box that a lot of people weren't ready to open on abortion rights and women's body choices and what the patriarchy continues to do when it comes to the rights of women. And in increasing assault, because this is a conversation that actually happened online. And everyone wants to know about, the narratives around abortion rights and what the precedents had been set. It was illegal. And getting such services was now illegal. Fast and forward, we come to Kampala, where it has never been illegal. Yes. And it almost feels like it was, we had a step forward and then 2 steps back in, women's rights when it comes to their bodies. How do we safeguard and push back going forward, for us to be able to allow women to own their bodies and the choices that they make with them?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. The Roe versus Wade case is an interesting one. And it's, personally, I think it's based on patriarchy and what people believe women should be doing and not doing. It's not right that patriarchy dictates what women should have and should not have in regards to body policy. I'll come to Kampala and refer to recently the just concluded issue on teenage pregnancies. Where the religious leaders came out and say this girl should be, not allowed into school. And then there are suggestions of having virginity tests, which is really absurd and obnoxious. Patriarchy tends to forget that these young girls and women most times are victims, that, like they're victimized. For example, if you look at the teenage pregnancies and the girls being, defiled. I'm not going to say made pregnant because it is a crime to having sexual intercourse with young girls. So girls who are defiled and end up being pregnant, then you boldly standing to say it's their fault that they're pregnant and so they should be deprived of another right to education and not be allowed in school. It's so absurd that in this era and day, we are still thinking about what women should and shouldn't do. When we're talking about urgency, control of your body as a person, then you're still saying because religion dictates, which I do not agree with. I don't think religion dictates for men to control women's body. Religion calls for protection. But if you fail as religious leaders to protect women, and they're saying, you fail to protect us, it's high time we decide what we need and consider protection for ourselves. And that includes deciding whether to keep a child or not, since you did not protect me not to have this child in the first place, not to be defiled and have this child. And then you're saying, no, we are not even giving you that right to protect yourself as a woman. It does not make sense to me. So as a woman, I think we need the agency and the independence and bodily autonomy as to decide what we want our bodies to do. Not for a man to dictate when for me to have a child or not. I should be in position to decide when I want to have a child and if I'm ready to have a child as a woman. Because look at pregnancy. Who carries it for 9 months? It's not the man. So why should you decide for me to be able to carry a human being in my body for 9 months when I feel I'm not ready to do that? And I think we should have the time to say, you know what? I'm not ready for a child. In case it happens because nature called that I should have sexual intercourse with you, and probably by accident. I'm not saying that everyone who gets pregnant, at the back of their mind, they want to. It could be probably a mishap in the contraceptives you're taking, or probably you're defiled, raped, and then you conceived. I should be able to say, not now. I still have ambitions. We are seeing women being CEOs. Probably it's coming to, interfere with my career growth, or it's interfering with my medical, or it's interfering with my ambitions as a woman or not I want to achieve. Funny enough, a woman produces one ovum, and she's going to be policed on how to take care of this ovum. Why shouldn't we control the sperms that come out in millions? Those are the people that can make pregnant 50 women pregnant at the same time. So what I'm trying to say is that the Roe versus Wade case to me was one that is sad to the achievements women have had over the years. For that case to come up, I just pray our judiciary doesn't look at it because it's not a common law, case. I pray they do not follow it as a precedence. And then we decide in the situation now, in the Ugandan setting, with COVID-19 pandemic, showing us how many girls were defiled. So then, if we do not legitimize abortion under certain circumstances, I'm not saying I'm supporting abortion fully, but we should consider what circumstances is abortion legal. And also this will promote proper maternal health for these children. Imagine if there's no a legal form of aborting, and then a child, because as a parent, I would want my child to continue with school if the school is considering expelling her because she's pregnant. And if she's a victim of defilement, I want her to go to school. There are no legal services to provide these services. I will definitely go the wrong way. I will use a local hub or whichever way to make sure that my child gets the education that I want her to get. So are we looking at the possibility of death traps of children trying to abort and the possibility of them dying vis-a-vis us wanting to look morally upright and not supporting and providing the services that these children need? I think it's something we should think about as women and as a country.
And when you talk about that, it also, reminded me of the fact that also sex education continues to be, an obscure thing in our systems. That there is little talk about sex, even in the face of, sex and violence happening in our epoch. But to bring Susan into the conversation around the progress that we've made as with the women's rights groups. I mean, we advocated for the formation seats, we got them. We advocated, a lot of other things, women getting into the workforce, we got that. But in light of that, it almost feels like, the patriarchal and social norms that will, police a woman's body still stay strong. And that at some points we even enable.
Yeah.
How do we, navigate or unlearn or even have conversation around, changing that narrative to be able to say, look, in as much as we have these gender norms, it shouldn't be the role that women do this and men do that, but that we can equally, exist together. Or that it doesn't necessarily mean that I should leave work and still have to serve at home. We can equally, help each other. How do we navigate such a narrative? Because it almost makes our advance irrelevant.
Yeah. The challenge that, let me call it the hurdle. Let me call it a hurdle. The biggest hurdle that women's rights activists face is the whole gender social mindset.
Yeah.
Flipping that mindset to overcome social values. I use that word very, very carefully. Norms and practices is very difficult, because most of the violations around women's rights are steeped in, you said it rightly, in patriarchy. They are steeped in cultural practices. They are steeped in social norms. And for us to flip that around, I think, is the biggest challenge that we are facing. Irrespective of all the programming that has been done, the legal reforms, the infrastructural gains that we are making, the institutional gains that we are making, for as long as we do not flip that mindset around, then we shall continue to have these challenges. And that mindset is not only a community thing, because you will find officials tasked with law enforcement, legal enforcement.
And so it's systemic.
Yes, it is systemic. If they carry that mindset from home to their workplace, then you have a challenge.
Yeah.
If a judicial or legal practitioner carries those mindsets, then you are done for, if that is going to influence their work. But if, even from an institutional point of view, institutions are not deliberately going that extra mile to be women-centered, gender-sensitive, to find out what is it that is actually going to, for example, provide substantive justice for this woman or this girl that has reported a case, or they are being kicked off their land. How can I, using my mandate, my role, actually make sure that what they go away with is real justice? That is a problem. One of the things I think we need to do, awareness, creating awareness, educating people is a given. We must never relent on that, because mindset change takes a very long time.
It does.
The other thing that we need to do is to tap into male-dominated spaces. Male-dominated spaces, male engagement is an important approach, but because in changing the mindsets of men, in changing how they approach women's rights, in changing how men or boys are groomed, and that, the values they grow up with, then we can be able to start to see some changes. But we must be very careful about this thing called male engagement. These days, I see a lot of pushback clothed as male engagement. Pushback because of this whole misleading narrative. Oh, women are over-empowered.
And so when
boys
you have
are
the
being left
girl
behind.
child, they're like, what about the boy
Yes,
child?
what about the boy child? No. The reason male engagement, even the policy that we have from the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, the reason it was developed was to support efforts to empower women and girls. So for as long as we lose the focus of what we are engaging the males for, then male engagement is just, another patriarchal tool.
Used to fight the women.
Yes, used to fight the
And
women.
it actually reminds me of a scenario where we're really talking about policy. And so these were youth, men who perhaps would have understood that having women in this conversation around policy, advocacy is very critical. And while we were setting up the panel, it was going to turn out into a manual. And then our push was that we cannot have a manual in a conversation where women are present.
True.
And the level of pushback we got from the men in the room was very problematic, because now I wonder, the earlier conversation was around, adding women to the conversation and, understanding the language and inviting them. And then the next conversation almost looks like the men don't want the women invited. And through pushback, we had the women there. But it speaks to what you're saying when it comes to male engagement. Is it possible that there will be a sapping of spaces, as we continue these conversations? Because now it almost feels like if we do not speak against manners, men are not conscious about our asks or about, including women in policy engagements, in building legislation and narratives. So how do we deal with, that kind of pushback that is happening now?
I think I think women should not be unapologetic against pushing back on that kind of thing. We should not make apologies. We should not try to try to accommodate some of those demands. I think, again, we need to just be very smart about how we go about the male engagement, because we are also seeing increasingly champions, even in sectors that were previously thought to be dead set against women's empowerment. In the faith-led, faith-based organizations, there is actually amazing work being done by faith-based organizations where they are standing up for women's rights. If you go into cultural, the cultural setting, if you go and address your mind to different tribes and you speak to them, there are even those that have done a lot of research, or they are documenting their cultural values, their practices that actually promote women's rights, protect women's rights. The thing is, I feel maybe as a movement, we are not using that enough. We're not using that enough. So, like I'm saying, I think we just need to be smart about it and strike that balance between fronting ourselves and our aspirations and letting that other section gain a certain amount of prominence. And actually, what we should be asking them to say is that this is not an usurping of power. No, it is not usurping power. Difficult, uncomfortable conversations have to start from somewhere. Yes, they just have to start from somewhere.
But if I may also ask, what is wrong with usurping power as women? Men have been usurping this power for over centuries. So if it's our time to usurp the power, why not? Why should we be apologetic about it? Yeah.
And that's what she said, women should not be apologetic. Maybe to bring Sanyu into this conversation as well, because you represent a minorities community. I mean, the women that you present are key, they lie in the key populations group. And in pushing for protection, how are you planning to collaborate with faith-based organizations? Because now there is a contention in narrative there, whereas it's very easy to ally with the women's movement and with human rights organizations. I wonder for so long, because as we push for collaboration, there are people in our community that have been, not just disempowered, but also excluded. So how are you, what's the intent, especially for high internet, in pushing, in empowering, but also in protecting them as we fight against violence?
Thank you so much. So, one, I would say there are so many structurally marginalized groups of women. We have women living with HIV, we have refugee women, we have queer women. So to bring all that,
disabilities.
Yes, thank you. So to bring all that in collaboration, we've looked for opportunities where women can meaningfully be engaged. Let me start with the tech world. We have a Tech Tuesday where we bring out opportunities that are available for women to take up, no matter the gender. And it's I think with the commitment and the skill format that you have to take up these opportunities. And then if we are to look at the the faith world, yes, we have a lot of disagreements there, but then we use the perspective of women. If a woman can stand up and say something, and why not be given an opportunity regardless the gender and how they conform to be. And then we've also had engagements of only feminine women. I mean, look at engaging women more. We've had conversations around gender and how we can incorporate gender into our daily activities and how to engage them more. Yes.
Maybe to bring Naima in, because we always talk intersection, and she brings in that very critical dynamic of, even in advocacy, we need to, be cautious that there are women living with HIV, there are women living with it, there are refugee women in advocacy, so that we don't only, look at the mainstream. So how do we intersection, or even how do we add our feminist practice to advocacy around gender-based violence?
Okay, so the feminist approach speaks to inclusivity and intersectionality when tackling issues of gender. And one thing I've noticed in the women's movement, we are like mainstreaming issues for women, and not being. I'm not saying everyone is doing it, but whoever comes out to speak about women, and if we're talking about women, we're talking like an everyday woman. That is you, me, and Susan, the people that we know, and we forget that different forms and categories of women are categorized in different vulnerabilities. So I, as a woman, do face violence. I call myself empowered because I can stand up and speak. So as an empowered woman, I do face violence of a certain level, and there's certain times I can be vulnerable. The more tables you shake and sit on, the more you're exposing yourself to violence from patriarchy and the people who feel like you're shaking this table, you're not supposed to be here. So I look at a refugee woman, what kind of vulnerability or violence that woman faces, because she's vulnerable in her category, the fact that she's a refugee woman, a person who is a guest in a country, she's faced more violence, running away from the wars, to come to the country that she's in, the host country. So her as a woman, how do we then engage or advocate for her rights against violence as a refugee woman? I can talk of an empowered woman who's a person with a disability. Statistics have shown that they face double the violence an ordinary woman faces. Then we need to be specific and intentional on how then do we bring on a woman who's a woman with disability. How do we tackle issues of violence regarding her? Then we have to look at a modern woman. Sometimes we think women who go to office, who work, the corporate sector, the arrivalism syndrome is that they arrived, they are not facing violence. And you wouldn't want to know the amount of violence they face, the fact that they sit in those boardrooms, in those offices with men.
Someone said it's lonely at that top.
It's lonely at that top for women, yes. There are a lot of holes they've faced for the fact that they got the power that they have. Women who have power face violence even more than us. The intimidation, the abusiveness, the verbal abuses they face for holding that position. Also have to look at the rural woman, the kind of violence she's facing. So when we're talking about gender-based violence or advocating for rights of women in regards to violence, we need to be cautious and specific, putting into consideration the different categories of vulnerabilities women face in the positions that they hold. It could be a housewife, the violence she faces, a woman who is doing, is a laborer, and this also speaks to the fact that if we look at the labor exploitation that we do, the most cases of violence that we face are women. These are women expect that are going to work and do better, but the violence cases we hear is appalling. So when we speak to violence, I'm not talking as Naima and the violence that I face, but the different categories of women that we face. Imagine women working in bars at night. What kind of violence they face? They are working, but their body is being abused on a daily. They're being verbally abused on a daily. So intersectionality and inclusion is very, very key and important when we're advocating for women's rights and violence against women, because we are cautious and we consider the fact that women are different, and every woman faces violence at one stage of time in a different setting and differently. So we need to be cautious about that.
And that's critical, especially in advocating for how we then address such challenges, because it's very easy to blanket case.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, they need money for the unpaid care work, and that is what you deal with, but you've not even dealt with, you know, the different underlying issues beyond unpaid care work.
Yeah.
So I hear you when you say dealing with different issues for different women differently, and addressing violence in the way that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the work that FIDA does, and not necessarily in case specific, but that there are women who have been, and maybe that is where I also bring you in, Susan. The women who have been, you know, in violent cases, and when you talk to them, naturally you would imagine that they want to say, "Oh, I want to leave," but the response to their needs, they're like, "Please talk to him to stop." And not necessarily that they want to leave their marriage, but that they want the violence to stop. And so in addressing this, it helps to understand how do you help different women differently. And to add to that conversation, maybe Susan, then you can help us when it comes to issues of femicide. And I'd want to say that it was specifically that pandemic that brought light to that, but that it was extremely highlighted. The femicides that happened, and not even just that, but that also even on the in the spaces where you don't expect women to die, women were dying. At the hands of security officers, women were dying. How do we deal with such, you know, a dynamic where accountability is rare, or even people are not held accountable to know the deaths of women that keep happening? And maybe to also bring you back to 2018, where the feminists and, you know, the women's rights movements where we are asking for police accountability to the Entebbe killings, which were mostly women. So how do we push for accountability in the face of femicide?
You know, one thing that I have come to learn in my career is that accountability towards matters concerning women tends to be on the lower end of the scale, you know. I do not know why. I think it's the whole importance attached to women's rights. You know, people may think it is not a right, it's not a duty, it is not owed to women, but it comes from that place of she is just a what?
A woman.
A woman. And I feel that is many a time how our institutions, some of our duty bearers actually approach some of these things. I remember the Entebbe killings. I remember that the Inspector General of Police at the time, Kale Kaihura, said these are women who, how did he say it? I think he said they had either provoked their husbands, they were prostitutes. He explained it away very dismissively. Yes,
they're just they met as well.
It was very dismissive, very dismissive. And to date, nobody has come back to tell us what is it that killed those women. What is it that killed those women? But it goes back again to our social fabric. For as long as communities, women themselves, women inclusive, do not think that they are of value, then we shall continue to put ourselves, you know, at the end of the line. Yes, at the end of the line. Accountability, I think, should even just start with all these structural problems that we seem to have in our law enforcement and I think judicial systems. The whole question of corruption. The whole question of corruption. Because if resources are not going where they should, if officers are not doing what they must, and we are letting it go, then the whole question of are rights enforceable, are they protected, you know, becomes it becomes a recurrent problem.
Thank you very much. I hear you. And this year when we speak connect, collaborate, and cooperate, it almost feels like we've now come to a place where we want to work together, you know, that multi-sectoral approach. How do we, and adding to that conversation, how do we add security officers with other entities that work for women's rights, even allies, to this conversation, to be able for us to connect, to collaborate and cooperate, so that it almost feels like we are all coming together, so that we don't work in silos in reaching such a goal.
One, I would start with the policy making. If the policy making looks at inclusion of everyone, I think we would have police women involved in the policy making. We would have marginalized women, we would have queer women, we would have women of all categories involved in the policy making. Because here I believe issues are said out from within, and I believe solutions still come from within, because these are the people that are going through these issues, and these are the people who are facing this violence, all types of violence, could be online, physical, or psychology, or anything related with violence. So I believe if we are to find a way of merging everything, collaborating and connecting this together, we need to involve everyone in the policy making.
And that's important. Naima, how do we stop working in silos?
Well, I'm going to borrow, there's a saying in the Quran that I read that says, when you save a life, you save the whole of humanity. And I'm going to paraphrase it in, when you protect a woman, you're protecting the whole of humanity. Why am I saying? Because issues of women, it's not for women alone. Every one of us might be or might not be or could be having a mother, a sister, a daughter. And if we talk about collaboration, it's not because it's them and this is us. A woman is a mother of a nation, whether you believe it or not. No one was not born by a woman.
True.
And we need to be intentional on issues of women, protecting women, ensuring that their rights are protected, ensuring that there's accountability for any wrongs that are done for women. And by collaboration, I'm talking about as women. I was having a conversation this weekend with some women, and I don't want to be an extremist. I don't want to be on the law. I want to be in the middle. No. Not having a position is dangerous.
It's dangerous.
And we need to make those women realize that if I'm going to talk about feminism, or I'm a feminist, it's not that I hate men. I think people misconstrue that. Let me start from that. All of us are feminists. The fact that we believe women have rights as human beings, that makes you a feminist. Once we agree on that, we've moved a step ahead. So collaboration means everyone holding everyone accountable for the actions that are being done against women, for the violence against. If you are accountable to your neighbor who is beating up a woman and you tell him, hey, what you're doing is not right, I'm going to hold you accountable for that, we can start from that. So collaboration is not only with the movement, but it starts from the community and the society. And I know we're talking about culture says, patriarchy says, but I would like to face that man called culture or patriarchy. And who is that? That is me, you, and everyone else. It is your mindset and what you believe. If you hold yourself accountable as a human being to women and what they're going through, then that is collaboration enough. Yes, with the movements, we need not to work in silos because we are all working towards the same goal and agenda to make sure that the women's rights are promoted, protected, and are being respected. So we can learn from one another. What works for ActionAid? What works for ActionAid to make sure that they achieved certain objective? You can, learn from them as an organization like Uganda, as FIDA, as UONET, learning from one another. One thing I've realized is that with patriarchy looks to divide and rule.
True.
So once we give them that gap to divide us so that they can rule, we will never reach our agenda. If we notice that this is what patriarchy is fighting to do as women, because we are at the forefront fighting for our rights, as women, we need to come together. And I'm talking about all women in the women movement and all women who are not even part of the women's movement. You making sure that your daughter has a say in the house, whether there are so many men or the father, she has a say and her voice is heard. That is enough collaboration with the women's movement. You're ensuring that your daughter's rights are protected and observed at home. That is collaboration enough as a family. Making sure that if she has to say something in a clan meeting, she says it. As a father, as a daughter, that is collaboration and protecting your child and empowering her to know her rights as a woman. Yeah, that's all I can say.
And so it's to say that all this mindset change and unlearning and patriarchal narrative should be dealt with from the family.
Yes, from
so
the family.
If we can begin from the family setting,
then we are winning.
Then we are winning.
Definitely.
So then the men know they can equally do the work that the girls are doing.
Yes.
And that makes sense. And in building momentum to growing, to changing narratives, to protecting and to advocacy around gender-based violence, what critical points should we look at as a country first, but then also on a global scale? Because it almost looks like we've done a lot.
Yeah.
But right now, what's critical for us to look at?
The one thing I always fall back on is what she just hinted on, the community.
Yeah.
You know, there's all this work being done by the government because that's the government's role and the mandate, and they have the resources. But what about us?
Yeah.
You know, if as a community in whichever space, deep in the village, in the urban areas, if we do not play our part, incidentally, all this information reaches us. But if we do not take it and use it, then we are going to continue to see the perpetration of violence against women. Because it is, I have the power to choose not to. I also have the power to stop abuse.
Yeah.
I have the power to participate.
And so on an individual basis,
yes,
we need to start that conversation
yes,
from there.
And as and even as a collective, when say there is a meeting in the village and people are called to participate, sometimes people do not. There are these discussions that are happening related to rights, and then tomorrow when the law comes out or when the policy is passed, they say, that law is for the Kampala women. But the discussion went on. I do not know the extent to which legislators actually go back to the ground and interact. That's a question for another day. Interact with their electorates. But when those opportunities are there, we don't. Even in Kampala here, where we have access to information, to everything, we do not participate. And then when it is passed, we come up in arms. So I think for me, as a Ugandan community, I think we are actually one of the biggest hurdles to that kind of transformation.
So we need to interrogate the critical conversations happening.
Yes.
If it's on land, what is our say as a community?
As a community.
Even as an individual. Yeah, because what I know, me as a woman, owning land is protection for me, security for me. So when there's a law on land, we should be, vigilant enough to want to inquire what it's about and how it's going to affect you as an individual.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. And then, in addition to our role as the community, I also think that we need to, one of the other critical things is to make that connection between what's happening at this national level and at the grassroots. There's a huge disconnect there. There's a huge disconnect there. Women's rights organizations are doing a lot of work, but sometimes if you go down to the woman in the village and ask her, is she even aware of these issues? She does not know. You just need to go just at the district, go and chat with people at district headquarters. And sometimes they're not aware of policy conversations going on in the parliament.
That's true.
They're not aware, for example, that the Ministry of Gender right now is drafting regulations around sexual harassment in the workplace. And these are people at the district, these are public servants. So how are we connecting those conversations? That is a big problem. And
that is also in language, in advocacy, in lobbying by the members of parliament, in interpretation. And so there is work there. I'm going to pause this conversation here for now. And then when we come back, I think we'll talk about safeguarding and then individual commitments from organizations. Let's come back.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
Welcome back to Civic Space TV. We continue the conversation around 16 days of activism around gender-based violence on women and girls. If you get a chance, in your community, whether you're a man or you're a mother or you're just a woman, please reach out to fellow women, encourage them, especially in times where also violence can be silent. So talk to someone. We want to continue this conversation, but to then understand on an individual basis when we speak locally, or organizationally, what are your activities or commitments towards, the celebration of the 16 days of activism around GBV?
Thank you so much, Gloria, once more. For the 16 days of activism, we are looking at carrying out online series, raising awareness on how to eliminate and prevent gender-based violence. Here we shall have participants do different types of games on how to prevent, and then maybe tackle on how to be resilient and on how to face these issues when they come along the way. We are also looking at doing the online engagement with producing different works on how to form support groups, just like you said, you talk to someone. And then we look at empowering women not to be silent, to find someone to talk to. We look at explaining what violence is in depth and letting people know what really violence is and how it manifests and how it can be controlled. So these are the different online series that will be running along social media platforms. The 16
and I
days
love
of
that you
activism.
talked about, silence and violence. And it begets me, like, I don't understand how to do why violence and silence work together. And maybe that's something, as you're interrogating the activities that you're doing, you help us understand if there is an explanation that we can put to why violence and silence seemingly work together.
Yeah. So thank you very much. As ActionAid, we are having a series of campaigns, but the target for our campaign is informed with the teenage pregnancies that happened during the pandemic. It was appalling that according to the 2021 report, it was recorded that about 31,565 teenage girls were pregnant monthly. And this really dictates to a daily pregnancy of 1,000 plus. So to us, we thought, what then? This is violence to the girl child. So our campaign is basically focusing on the welfare and well-being of the girl child. And we'll be doing like 3 hashtags: end teenage pregnancy, end violence against girl child, and then also ending child marriage. And what informs us is that we've noticed that child marriage is not only a violation for human rights for the girls and a crime, but also contributes to their well-being, their welfare, and dictates how they would live their future. If you're a teenage mother, then when pregnancy comes in, so many things are affected that might not enhance how you future, what your plan would be like. And to be a doctor, imagine out of school, would you be that? So that's where our campaign is focusing. And the focus of the campaign also is to call out the different stakeholders and policy makers on the death trap that we are facing. If we ignore child marriages and teenage pregnancies, then it's going to affect the nation in regards to its future income, the economy, and also the well-being of its people. So that's where the campaign is going to be focusing on. And as an organization, and I think as a country, it's important we be cautious on the services we give the youth, the young people, and how we protect the rights of the women and the girl child, because in the end it dictates the quality of the citizens that you will have as a country. Imagine you're having dropout mothers from school, or young people or boys that are dropping out because because the law talks about equality. If the girl drops out, even the boy should drop out. Then how many, if you're having 1,000 pregnant girls daily, that means 1,000 probably would drop out of school, and the boys will definitely have to drop out of school. Then what kind of the future citizens are you going to have who are uneducated and unskilled? Then how then does that dictate to the economy, of the country? And we'll also be doing a series of different campaigns like radio talk shows, community dialogues, because ActionAid is spread in, Katakwi, the east and the north. So we're looking to have conversations on still child marriages and ending teenage pregnancies. I think we had also planned an award ceremony in Komi for the leaders who are champions of, fighting against gender-based violence. We had also scheduled a run or a walk with the Speaker of Parliament in Kumi still to just create awareness on what gender-based violence looks like, what child marriages and how it affects the girl child and the future. And then we're also hoping to have a public dialogue with district stakeholders in Amuria to see then how can we have conversations that would influence the policy. And then to top it up, we're having a national symposium on the 22nd of this month to discuss, ending child marriages, teenage pregnancies, and how then the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development can come in. Which policies do we have to do? What else? How can we lobby to ensure that there are laws that are really functional that could protect the girl child and her rights and also the rights of women?
And allow me to interrogate that, because it opened for me a Pandora of the chicken and the egg narrative of we cannot talk about child marriages without also talking about the obstacles around education for girls, for girls, and how, keeping girls in school was very important. I think that is a highlight for me in the pandemic, was very important, with the number of the children that ended up, having children having children.
Child mothers.
And so, and it's problematic because I looked as like, oh, wow. For 2 years, we had the longest lockdown when it came to school closure. And for 2 years, the only protection that children should have had was not there, and it was school. Regardless of the fact that there are also instances of child pregnancies, even in school. There was a protection there. Fast forward, fast forward, we have the Ebola pandemic, and again, schools are closed before time. I almost feels like the one safe space that children have keeps. So should we interrogate education as an entity, as a sector in Uganda when it comes to violence against girls, especially?
I think we should, because for me, basing on the pandemic and the effects it had on girl child, I think school is the safest space now. We can say it's the safest place for a girl from violence, especially assault, sexual assault and sexual harassment and defilement. Because if the report says that 1,000 girls were getting pregnant during the pandemic, that is like, we should wake up. Like, so it's that means it's a aha moment. Then we as parents, how are we contributing to creating safe spaces and homes for our children? And are we doing anything much, or leaving all the work to the schools? So it is sad that they get pregnant under our watch in our homes. And we think that our homes are very safe. So we need to interrogate the education sector, and how then can we better the education sector to ensure that the girl child is protected in the education system, to ensure that it is there throughout, even pandemic cannot affect their safe space.
Yes. That's true. And maybe to close this conversation, or even just to continue it depends on how far we go. There've been issues of climate change and women suffer. There've been issues of pandemic and a global one at that, and it was the women and the girls at the heart of the vulnerabilities. And we have also femicides happen. We have domestic violence happen. I almost looks like in the face of crisis, we also have wars happening in this epoch. Almost feels like where there is crisis, women and girls at the center of the vulnerabilities. And as you respond to your question or of what your entity is doing during this time, how do we safeguard women in narratives where a crisis almost feels like it's a punishment? Not even just a punishment, it is categorized for the girl child and for the women. How do we safeguard?
I think suffering has a female face.
Yeah, even poverty.
You know, yes, suffering definitely has a
I
female
rebuke that.
face, because any catastrophe, any upheaval to social life
Yeah.
will affect women more disproportionately than it does men.
Yeah.
If you look at the pandemic, in addition to creating situations, those unsafe spaces that we've spoken about that put girls, you know, in compromising situations and they ended up being survivors of sexual violence, we need to think about the difficulty in accessing social and health services. We need to think about the inequalities that were created by that, the poverty that was deepened because women's access to work, you know, was taken away, or the capacity of a family, a household to bring in an income. All of those are drivers of violence against women. All of those are drivers of violence against women. Now, what we can do, it takes a multi-sectoral approach. It takes a multi-sectoral approach that actually starts from, I think it's from the planning stage, for us to even be aware of looming danger. You referred to climate change. There are elements of climate change for which, as a country, we need to have an early warning mechanisms
And some
systems.
ballet floods should never have been ballet floods because
but
the rains were coming.
exactly. Every year it hits us and we react like it's the first time it's happening.
That Bududa shouldn't be an issue now.
It should not be an issue. The issues around civil war or civil war happening in neighboring countries, we need to have early warning systems. So as a country, we are preparing for these things. When refugees, when refugee situations start to become apparent, as a country, are we preparing for it? You know, I think our planning for catastrophe is at an all-time low. We are reactionary, you know, we do not look to that point where, for example, COVID has taught us nothing about how to organize our health systems, about how to plan for life shocks.
And so no wonder Ebola is a shock
is here
for us
and school has ended 2 weeks early and children are being sent home again, and this now it is a long holiday. So the question, for me, the question would be, you know, the answer would lie in, as a country, strengthening our social protection measures, you know, so that we have these cushions when there is a shock, especially the woman is not left destitute.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And then what are you planning as an organization, as commitments and activities for the next 16 days?
Yes, the 16 days campaign against gender-based violence for UONET is a moment to recommit, you know, to upholding the rights of women, to protecting the rights of women, and to try to build as many champions as possible, but also to speak to duty bearers to say, how far have you gone? What are you doing? You know, it's a time for us to reflect on what has happened in the last 1 year and to, you know, set an agenda for the next 12 months based on the women's rights concerns that have happened in the last 1 year. Yes, so as UONET, we are having a number of engagements, both at the national level here and across the 80-odd districts that we work in. We are going to have community dialogues, basically speaking about violence against women. Yes, the campaign is gender-based violence, but we remain positively biased against violence against women. Yes, so community dialogues to engage communities at that level, but also to engage with leaders at the various levels at district, in district structures, both in the customary informal justice sector, that is the cultural and religious leaders, and then the technical and political wings at the district. So we are going to have some engagements around that, basically to put on the agenda the question of violence against women and what actions can be done to prevent and to respond to it. We are also going to have media activity, particularly radio spot messages, like I said earlier. The question of awareness and information does not stop.
Yes.
So we're going to be having radio spot messages. We have planned for talk shows. We've also planned for a TV show. We are also going to have a press statement. A press statement basically to highlight what the concerns are right now. Every year there is a small change.
Yes.
Or there are 2 or 3 incidents that actually jar you and say, okay, the fight needs to continue. So we're going to have a press statement, which in our case, we want to also link to the districts that we work in, to the networks that we work in the districts. They will also hold similar engagements and share that information there as well. And then we run legal aid clinics in Namutumba and Busoga. So we're going to have mobile legal aid clinics at that level where the centers will provide services closer to the people. This is holistic. It will involve legal education. It will involve people have the access to speak to a lawyer, access to speak to a counselor, to ask questions, and also interact with duty bearers at that level. They shall be invited to come and be part of it. Then we're also going to have youth engagement activities, particularly with the universities where we work, to speak about violence against women within the universities, particularly how to protect themselves, but what to do when it has happened, and basically to grow their sense of responsibility and agency to be part of the protection network at that point. I think that summarizes it. That really summarizes it.
Thank you very much. And as you're sharing, all of you, one thing kept coming back. I'm just glad that this is work that continues.
Yes.
Because a lot of people would imagine that, oh, is it just specific for this? But no, this is work that continues through the months, through the 12 months. And not necessarily, whereas it may take a little bit of a sideline, it will still be important to deal with these issues. And then maybe as a closing, the 16 days also end with the World AIDS Day. And I do not want to take from the fact that whereas we've made progress around, dealing with HIV/AIDS, we still have work there, even for women. Because that's a conversation we're not going to shun away from, that protecting women against, HIV/AIDS is as critical, even in our conversation around violence. Because there have been very many people that have been raped, that have acquired HIV/AIDS through violence. And so we cannot take health away from violence. I'm just glad that that conversation at the end of the 16 days ends with a critical question of how we are safeguarding women against HIV/AIDS as well. Thank you for joining us. I don't want to take a lot of more time. I've been your host, Tricia, Gloria, Nabaye. I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye for now.